Catherine Amirfar.
And I'm Cal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law.
I'm Cal Raustiala, co-host of the American Society of International Law podcast, International Law Behind the Headlines. And it's a great pleasure to welcome on the podcast today two good friends of the American Society, friends of mine, and people who are probably well known to a lot of the listeners. So Adrien Wing is the Associate Dean for International and Comparative Law and the Murray Professor at Iowa College of Law. And Catherine Powell is Professor of Law at Fordham College of Law or School of Law. And Adrien and Catherine, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Cal. So great to be here with you.
Thanks for having us.
So, yeah, it's my pleasure. And I've invited Catherine and Adrien on to talk about a recent symposium that they helped organize and introduce in AJIL Unbound. The title of which is Introduction, or their piece was Introduction to the Symposium on Feminist Approaches to International Law, 30 Years On, with a colon, then followed by Still Alienating Oscar, which is a reference to a famous piece, and we'll get into that famous piece in a moment. But I think first, I just wanted to ask you both, or whoever wants to go first, to just say a little bit about the Symposium on Feminist Approaches to International Law. This is obviously a topic of great interest to many of us. And, you know, this is a chance, as I read the symposium, to kind of assess the work that's gone on. But tell us a little bit about the motivation behind the symposium and how it came to be, and just give us some context for it.
Yeah, thanks, Cal. So this is Catherine. First, I just want to start by honoring the three co-authors of the original AJIL article, Feminist Approaches to International Law, which was groundbreaking, right? And so Hilary Charlesworth, Christine Chinkin, Shelley Wright, 30 years ago, they were way ahead of their time, co-wrote this article. And I also just want to acknowledge Adrien Wing, whose idea it was to, 30 years on, do this symposium in AJIL Unbound. The article that was written in 1991, about 10 years on from that, so I guess that would have been, 2001, I co-taught a seminar with Karen Knopp, our dearly beloved colleague from AJIL, who we just lost this past year, who was visiting at Columbia when I was teaching the Human Rights Clinic there, and another colleague, Julie Peters, who is in the English department at Columbia. The three of us co-taught a class on, it was an international law workshop on gender culture difference, which was intended to honor the 10-year anniversary of the Chinkin Charlesworth Wright article, where we brought in guest speakers from a variety of disciplines, including then Charlesworth, Chinkin, and Wright, who came to the last class in that seminar. Here we are 30 years on. Adrien came up with this brilliant idea of doing an AJIL Unbound symposium to see where we are, where feminism has traveled, where it hasn't traveled in these last 3 decades. Now, when Adrien proposed this a year ago, this was before Dobbs. This was before our recent midterm election here in the United States. It was before a number of developments that have really been seismic in this last year for women's rights. So in a large sense, Adrien was quite prescient in recognizing that this was the moment to talk about this landmark article from 3 decades ago.
Great. Yes, I think I totally... Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Adrien.
Yeah. Also, because of this 30 years, I participated in a new series of the American Journal of International Law board called Bookmarked. And we were highlighting, articles for each decade of the journal. And so I chose this article, Feminist Approaches to International Law, which became the first of the Bookmarked series, which was just 5 minutes of highlighting things out of the article. And so I thought, that 5 minutes was very frustrating. And gee, wouldn't it be great if we could expand that out to do a whole AJIL Unbound symposium?
Well, it's great to do these kinds of things. And I actually think it's a real service to our larger community, our invisible college, to go back retrospectively and look at not only a landmark piece, in this case, a piece that really encapsulated and spawned a huge literature, but one that has lasting staying power. So I really applaud both of you for doing this, and I recommend to listeners that they read the symposium. It's quite interesting, and obviously still 30 years on, the piece has a lot of relevance, but the additions done in the symposium are great. For maybe some younger listeners, who is Oscar, and what is the concern in your both in the title of the original piece that you're talking about, but in your title as well? What's the concern with alienation? Just explain that for us.
And maybe I'll jump in on that, because Oscar Schachter was a colleague of mine when I taught the Human Rights Clinic at Columbia. He, of course, is just was a larger than life person who had been an editor of AJIL himself, who had been a real leader in the Invisible College, Cal, that you just alluded to, and just a real sweetheart, a real mensch. And basically, the folklore is that Charlesworth, Chinkin, and Wright, I think Hillary Charlesworth in particular, had tried to raise these concerns around the feminist critique of international law at a illustrious international law conference, and was, it was very difficult for her to get to the microphone, essentially, metaphorically and practically speaking. And Oscar basically said, let her have the microphone, and spoke up to create space for this feminist critique that didn't sit well with many members present. So the three of them then apparently wrote this article initially on a cocktail napkin, like went across the street to a bar to sort of, debrief on how difficult it was to raise this feminist critique. And that, notes on the cocktail napkin became the AJIL article that we now all know and have paved the way for so many of us to find voice in the academy.
And
Great.
of course,
Go ahead, Adrien.
This situation and how they wrote this article becomes interesting, because when they wrote it, there were people who thought, oh, you're going to alienate the great Oscar by writing this stuff. And apparently, even though he disagreed with some of the analysis that they were doing then, he was curious and encouraging of what they did. And so that's why in our subtitle, we're saying, still alienating Oscar. What would he, not only he, but people like him, or these senior grand eminences of international law, what do they think even today about issues relating to feminist approaches? It isn't like, oh, we've all handled all that, we all understand it. No, we don't all understand it, or even many don't agree that there could be or should be a feminist critique involving international law.
That's exactly right. And it's the alienating Oscar subtitle is also a reference to a piece that Hillary Charlesworth wrote called Alienating Oscar, Feminist Approaches of International Law. Really, it's sort of, I guess, a symbol of, if you're alienating Oscar, you're basically, you're disrupting, right, the mainstream of international law. Though, as Adrien said, Oscar was actually very welcoming of the critique.
Yeah, I actually conflated these two pieces in my mind, but thank you for pointing out that they're really two separate and very important pieces. Let's turn to where we stand 30 years on. I want to talk a bit about, obviously, many aspects of what's in the symposium, and maybe what isn't, or what you hope to have been in and maybe couldn't fit or chose not to. But how do you both are, I think it's fair to say we're all seasoned international lawyers at this point, and we were around for this original piece 30 years ago, and we're here still today in positions of importance within AJIL, for example. How do you see the changes personally 30 years on, in terms of the lasting impact of the critique that was leveled in that piece, but also the critiques that were made by others at the same time or following on? Have we done a good job as a field in incorporating feminist critiques? Have they been normalized? How would you sort of assess that?
I guess I'll go first on this. I did an article for a feminist reader where I did the only international law piece, And so I researched all of the articles that had been done in every subfield of international law, and there were quite a few. So on the one hand, that's incredible, that I don't know if there were 50 articles, 100 articles, so that there's been a lot of progress in writing pieces involving different aspects of feminism or women's rights. On the other hand, it's very siloed. So the people that do other areas of international law don't involve feminism at all in whatever they're talking about. And so that's a problem, right? If something is so ghettoized that, okay, the feminists were interested, there's something about international, but the rest of international law is not saying, how can I write an article on whatever the issue is without citing this literature? And right now they don't.
And maybe just to build off what Adrien just said, I mean, I think there are two components. One is about substance, the other is about representation. So, even for Charles Worth Chinkin and Wright to be in that room was perhaps unusual at that international law conference. But, over the last 3 decades, we've seen geographic, gender, race, many forms of diversity grow within the society as well as within AJIL. However, it wasn't until only 8 years ago that AJIL elected their first Black board of editors, with Hank Richardson being the first African-American, and then other editors being included, other men of color, and Natalie Reid as the first Black woman as a corporate lawyer. The very next year, I was the first Black woman scholar elected to the board of editors. So this is after 100 years, right, of being in existence. That took 100 years to elect its first Black editor. Now, representation doesn't correlate with substantive outlook, of course, so we know from Clarence Thomas to other examples, but it does mean that we bring in a wider range of experiences, and we have many editors from sub-Saharan Africa, from China now, from across the Americas, and it does bring a range of experience, which is important.
I think that's really well put, Catherine. And I, as a former board member myself, I'm, ashamed and sort of shocked at those numbers and that history. And I know many of us in the society feel the same way, and it's a long overdue correction. But you're right; it doesn't necessarily yield immediate change, or even mean that that's going to sort of disseminate throughout the readership or the writers of the journal, but it certainly goes a long way towards assisting that. And I'm curious, since both of you now sit on the board, do you see a change? Are you able to, either in your capacity as board members, exercise some degree of editorial influence to kind of mainstream, to kind of go back to a point Adrien made a moment ago about silos, to mainstream feminist or racial critiques? Or is it still really a challenge to see that brought into what I think is the flagship journal in the world of international law? Is that still something that you find a kind of uphill battle?
Well, the first part is that now the journal board is much, much more diverse. If you look at the list in terms of women, people of color, different whole parts of the world. So that's the first stage, diversify the people. That's the second issue about, okay, well, does it make a difference and all that? But first, let's get demographic diversity. But now we're also in that next phase. Okay, that's very nice. We have a diverse set of editors, but what about the content? There is a need for diversifying more of the content, whether that be feminist theory, issues on, critical race theory, or TWAIL, Third World Approaches to International Law. There's lots of things, that very few topics that have actually not been published. And so that's the next phase. Can we, in the next few years, start publishing articles or commission articles or something to be able to get these whole areas of international law that have not appeared in the journal at all, or have been very marginal in terms of appearances, with more appearing in the Unbound? And you mentioned before limitations of Unbound. The Unbound you can only have 3,000 words. Yeah, and that's, that's very small, and you can only have so many pieces. So we had, 4 authors plus ourselves, only 3,000 words a piece. So that's not very much space, for these sorts of topics.
And at the same time, I think that even just having a more diverse board already has translated, for example, Adrien, who was already a heavyweight, having authored the Critical Race Feminism Reader and the Global Critical Race Feminism Reader, proposed the idea for this symposium. We have other editors, Tendai Achiomi and James Gatti, who are now co-editing an Unbound symposium on critical race theory. We've had major pieces on third world approaches to international law, TWAIL approaches. We just recently unveiled an Unbound symposium on Latin American approaches to international law. That was our first bilingual ever symposium in Spanish and English, which is just such a huge contribution. And so I think there are ways in which we already see that representation has made a difference.
Okay, now don't forget, Catherine did an article herself on COVID that is very path breaking. And, so taking issues like that, that are very topical, we're just beginning to put articles like that into even the Unbound. Her article was in a Yale journal, but we've all been talking about Unbound. These topics need to be put in the regular, AJIL, in more depth, and not only in the Unbound.
And to be clear, part of what's challenging, Cal, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, is that each of us as scholars, I think we oftentimes pivot between passion projects and projects that are trying to engage, a variety of audiences. And so whether that's the mainstream of the academy, and, the first piece I published in AJIL was on Libya and the Libya intervention from, 2011. The use of force. But, I think for many of us, we pivot back and forth between engaging the mainstream and then other passion projects. Cal, I know you're coming out with your new book on Ralph Bunche, which I imagine was quite a passion project and another important historical African-American figure. But one of the ways in which Charlesworth, Chinkin, and Wright have been such path breakers, to go back to them, is that I remember talking with Christine Chinkin many years ago when she was visiting at Columbia about how she pivots between feminist theory and international arbitration, and how important as women it is for us to both prove ourselves to a still predominantly male international law academy, even while we're trying to widen the lens to include feminist approaches and other critical approaches.
Agreed. So let's talk a little bit about kind of how you came to develop the symposium, and then also what's missing in it, in your view. What are the things you couldn't? Adrien just referenced the problems of space, and it is true, Unbound is very constraining, as I think all of us who have written in Unbound know. 3,000 is challenging, though. I have to say I'm a big fan of Unbound, partly because it does give us as readers the ability to get a lot of things that we wouldn't otherwise get. And so I think Unbound has really served a great role, and I hope it will continue in the future, but it's without question constraining. So you had to make choices. There are topics perhaps that you couldn't address. What's not in the symposium that you wish was there, that you see as really kind of a burning issue as we assess 30 years on this groundbreaking intervention?
Well, we don't have an overt LGBTQ article, although we have an author who is herself lesbian, but she wasn't writing, from that perspective. And so to me, it would have been great to get an article that engaged with that, as well as we don't have an article that is overtly deeply grounded in critical race theory or critical race feminism. And so, that those are ones I wish we could have had. And, in some cases we approach authors and they're not available or things don't work out. And so, it's very limited pool of people who write in the areas. And that is often frustrating, that people will say, oh, where's this article or that article? And, we wish, and also that we wish we could have more room to have more articles on different topics.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in a symposium, you can only do so much when you can only publish, say, 4 or 5 authors. And as Adrien said, we really wanted a queer critique. We thought it was important to talk about the gender binary. So not only queerness, but the idea of there being a gender binary, which underlays so much of sex discrimination law. We try very hard, but, ultimately, again, people's availability and what people end up choosing to write about. We could have covered Indigenous women, more on critical race approaches. Adrien and I tried to capture that in our intro. But ultimately, we wanted to respect what the authors that we ended up getting, what they wanted to write about. And they brought, I think, a really rich, diverse array of perspectives.
Agreed. You have really a lot in there, and I think I again commend the introduction that you both wrote to our listeners, because I think you do a really good job of kind of putting this all together and providing a nice kind of overview, but at the same time a kind of assessment. So as we look back at the trajectory of the feminist critique that was, I don't want to say it was launched in that piece, because obviously it had been around for some time, but that really laid down a marker that was quite influential. We talked a bit about how AJIL as a particular site for scholarship has begun to change a little bit, and to maybe it's obviously a more diverse board, as we talked about, but we still, I think it's fair to say, don't see feminism as a through line, or even a kind of consideration in many of the articles that appear in the journal. And that's not necessarily a rap on the journal, because I think that's probably a critique we could level at the field more broadly. I think the journal is maybe slower than some places, but it's generally in the mainstream. And so this is, in a sense, going back to Adrien's earlier point about siloization. I guess that's my sense, is that there's still a fair bit of siloization. And your piece made me reflect on that a little bit and think about, in my own work, have I thought enough about feminist approaches? Have I thought enough about feminist critiques as they relate to topics that might not seem obvious at first? There are some that are, maybe more amenable, but some that are amenable nonetheless, even if they don't come to mind immediately. So what can we do as a field? What can our listeners do, many of whom are writing their own scholarship, writing their own papers, to think about incorporating either the insights that were leveled 30 years ago, or the ones that are coming out now, which are, in some ways much more varied and, and very interesting. So what can we do as a field? What do you recommend?
Well, some of it is mentoring. There may be somebody there, they specialize in law of the sea. And so you talk to them and say, hey, have you thought about gender and law of the sea? And there's actually a whole anthology that won an award from AJIL. So maybe that person would have never thought about gender, in whatever's their other specialty. And so we as members, have to help people, whether they're young, new members or more senior, to think out of the box in these ways as we move forward. And also, we don't have the statistics on, how many people wrote feminist articles and submitted them to the journal and were rejected. Or is it that people don't even submit them? And is that because they're not writing them, or is it because they think the journal would be hostile? So there's many different sub-issues involved that we would have to explore more deeply to think about, how do we increase the number of articles in this kind of a field that are published.
Yeah, I think that's right. And mentorship and supporting junior scholars and students, both in looking back at what the stories that have been untold, as we are, learning about Pauline Murray and others who played such a huge role, but whose, contributions weren't really recognized. Karen Engel's piece, her essay in our symposium, goes back to the sort of radical roots of feminist critiques of war during the Cold War period. So, decades before the Chink and Charles Wright article, looking at the contributions of feminist theorists to talk about peace and warfare. So backwards looking, but also forwards looking. And I'm teaching a feminism, race, and the law class this semester where my students have talked about issues ranging from ecofeminism and just feminist approaches to the whole global climate change issue. Everything from that to, sort of beauty in the bar, right? And our junior scholars are seeing the world through very different lenses because they're inheriting this climate crisis and because of the ways in which they are rethinking gender and the gender binary in ways that brings a very different experience than those at our stage of our career professionally. So I think to refresh our thinking on gender and feminism, supporting junior scholars is so critical.
Well, that's really excellent, and I really want to applaud both of you for putting this together. And again, I want to commend to listeners the symposium, which is recently out, published I think in September on AJIL Unbound. So, Adrien and Catherine, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I very much hope we'll be able to have you back soon.
Thanks very
Thank
much,
you.
Al. Lots of fun.